everybody, in this video we're going to be covering the other moves that black can play after e6, b3. Black has several moves at his disposal and we'll be looking at briefly at d5, at a6, d6, and of course knight to c6. Now I would like to start off briefly with d5, which is not very popular, and I think the reason for it is that white can either give check on b5 immediately or take and play check. And frankly, after something like knight c6, he can already consider giving quite an annoying check on e2. But the simple reason is really that most players do not like the positions arising after white playing d4 later on, which almost always will lead to some sort of isolated pawn positions, which are quite difficult for black to play. So d5 is not that popular over here and not something you really have to worry about. Instead, the move d6 is what always struck me as the right way for black to play, until I really started looking into it. Now, d6 in itself is not that special, but with the idea of e5, black generally gives off a pretty clear indication of his ideas. Black wants to shut down the bishop on b2 and then develop his pieces accordingly, something like knight f6, knight c6, bishop e7, and then see what to do next. I think that white definitely has to try and go for the idea with c3, d4 over here. I personally had a game in which my opponent played something like bishop to d3 and then went for c3, bishop c2. I felt that it's a little bit too slow and I wasn't quite satisfied with it for white. Instead, I think white can hurry up a little bit more and play bishop to b5 check after, for example, bishop d7 takes, and let's say c3, knight f6, queen e2. We see that we are already ready to play d4 and develop our knight to d2. And I think that leads to slightly better positions. For example, bishop to e7, short castle, d4. Is once again, we could get into structures that we've seen in the previous video where after takes, rook d1 would be a very accurate move. As you can see, we want to play c4 and knight c3. The big difference here is really that rook d1 is quite nice because it already stops black from achieving knight f8, knight e6 anytime soon, or knight b8, knight c6, which would be a good maneuver if we do get the pawn to d4 at some point. So for example here, bishop to d6 followed by this, and putting the knight to d4 could create some counterplay eventually, but rook d1 is a good move because it would force black to make another move in order to get his pieces in a way to set up that maneuver. So this is a bit better for white, and also if black decides to take twice on d4, I just don't think that this is enough for equality. Black has that isolated pawn and doesn't have all that much active play in return to offer for it. So this seems to be slightly better for white once again. So d6, e5 is not really something that causes too much of a headache for white here. Likewise, I think after knight f6, a move that you have to remember as white is to go e5 here, which leads to very pleasant positions. For example, if black goes bishop d6 over here, f4 is a nice move, and it actually looks like one of the schemes that we were looking at in the previous video, where white now also puts the bishop on d3 and then develops the knight to c4. So for example, this was a game by Antipov, the current world junior champion, who really likes to play this line as white, the b3 variation. And here clearly he was on the right track to set up a very nice attack with knight c4, queen f3, queen h3, bring in the other rook. And as we can see, black is really quite passive and will struggle to find play of his own. So e5 definitely gives white some initiative. Another way would be to immediately challenge the knight on e5. Again, f4 is an important move. We definitely want to take back with the pawn on e5 in order to once again get some space, and maybe later on we could use the d6 square and also create some play on the king side with queen to g4. And if black decides not to take, I like the move a4, preparing knight a3. And over here knight a3 is still very strong. Because after knight takes e5 we have this little move knight b5 and we're attacking the queen. If the queen moves, then we have check, takes, and f takes e5 with some material gains. And bishop takes e5 would be the given move, but after takes, knight to b5, queen b8, d4, even though we're a pawn up, this looks like a very scary initiative already. So this is not something to be recommended for black either. After c takes d4, queen takes d4, we already have checks on d6, we can castle queenside quickly, and the black king is not going to feel very safe. So d6 actually leads to positions which in my opinion are simply unpleasant for black, and white should be a bit better there. Next on we have the move knight c6, bishop to b2, d5. Here d6 would be possible, but I think that actually after d4 white gets a pretty good position over here, where if he wants to he can take next on c6, but also it would be healthy to set up in case black, for example, goes a6, we could think about playing c4 once again, going into a structure that we're quite familiar with at this point. So that's not something that black tends to play a lot. The other move here would be something like knight to f6, and after takes, we already have an option of playing e5 over here, thereby sort of mixing up the structure of black's pawns. So also this would lead to slightly unpleasant endgames, and knight c6 in combination with d6 is not so often seen for that reason. d5 is the move I was looking at over here, and I was checking bishop to b5 here, which again is one of those little moves that you want to know about, because most of the time d takes e4, knight e5 is not something black wants to really go for. After queen c7, knight a3, we do not immediately win back the pawn, but we will have very rapid development and should be able to win it back one way or another. And there's some initiative over here for white. Knight f6 instead seems like the right move. And after e takes d5, queen e2 check, we once again reach a position which after d4 we could go for the isolated pawn position, but the question is whether our piece placement with the bishop on b5 and queen on e2 here is really optimal for that. Also black could maybe consider to go a6 soon, and we might have to take on c6 and thereby strengthening the pawn structure. So instead I actually like the move bishop takes f6 over here, just using opportunity to cause a double pawn. And the positions arising in this structure do not really appeal to me too much for black. Black obviously has the bishop pair, and there is something to say for his compensation of those structural deficits, but especially after this move queen to d3 over here, which I think is very instructive and important to remember in this position, because it's actually allowing the knight to regroup to a more dangerous space. I think that this is actually quite unpleasant for black, and I don't think black should be happy to play this at all. So this idea of queen e2 check over here is really just annoying, because bishop to e6 would be followed by knight g5. Queen to e7 also doesn't quite strike me as a very good move. We might even go knight e5 immediately then, and it's blocking black's development much more than white's, because we've already developed our bishop to b5. And bishop to e7, bishop takes f6 also is not something that you should normally allow. So knight to c6, bishop to b5 also seems to give white definitely some good play. Next on, after b3, we have this move a6, which I think is possibly the most respectable option after b6. The idea of a6 is actually not entirely clear. It's kind of a good waiting move. It's almost always useful in the Sicilians. I recommend to just go bishop to b2. Now after knight c6, there's no longer bishop to b5 idea, so black doesn't have to worry about that. And here I like the move c4. So c4 is indicating that we might be interested in going for d4 later on, going back into the type of hedgehog structure that we saw a lot in the bishop b5 check, bishop d7 Sicilian. So with those ideas in mind, if black goes something like d6 here, d4, we will have a look at that briefly, but it should not be something too new to any of you. Queen c7 was played here mostly, and here after knight c3, knight f6, we would like to play d4, but after black goes bishop to b4 here, the pawn is hanging, and it's not entirely clear if we can get a real Maroczy structure here without doing some sort of strange concession. Like f3 over here looks a little bit odd with the bishop being on b2, and also taking on c6 would sort of fix black's pawn structure with d takes c6 or b takes c6. So this is not really the type of position we want to go for. I think g3 immediately is a better idea. If black goes for d6 now, we get into the position I was talking about previously. This was a game of Romanov, and I think that this is actually a rather pleasant position for white. Once again, it's a slightly new setup with both bishops being fianchettoed, but the general idea of stopping b5 and d5 holds, and actually with the bishop on g2, that turns out to be maybe even easier. So in the game, black took on d4, queen takes d4, and after castle, castle. Obviously, white could just go for knight c3 and put the rooks in the center, maybe play f4. He would be better, but actually the move e5 was also quite nice, which is played in the game, and after something like d takes e5, queen takes e5, these endings seem very unpleasant for black to me, who is really suffering from some issues to develop his pieces on the queen side, whereas white can quite easily increase the pressure. So this was the game Romanov-Kahn from St. Petersburg 2013, and quite a good indication on why d6 should probably not be played by black in this position. Instead, knight f6 is quite provocative, but I do think it's the best move. Here I like the move e5, knight to g4, queen e2. And this position is probably critical for the a6 variation, but I haven't quite been able to find a way that I really like for black here. Currently we're following a game of Peter Svidler, and even though Peter got a pretty good position after the move knight h6 over here, note that of course the position once again looks quite good for white with the pawn on e5, but at least now the knight's already on another side of the board, and if he can go knight f5, knight d4, it might backfire to have the pawn on e5, where it also kind of potentially a target. So one way that black should not play here is, for example, d6. I think that it just takes a lot of time because he can't take on d6 with the bishop, and after the following moves white managed to play d4 on the next move, and I think that it was a pleasant position. It's the game Priyadarshan against Paragua from 2014, so this would be what could happen if black decides to immediately try to fight against the pawn on d6. In the game, the move knight to h6 was played, as I said, and here knight a3 is what Romanov played, which allowed, I believe, black to regroup with knight f5 and get a decent position out of this. Instead, I like the move knight to c3 over here, which actually uses the fact that the pawn is not under attack 3 times currently, and we have time to put our knight to e4. So after knight f5, knight e4, I like white's prospects. After we develop sort of naturally on both sides, we can already think about playing g4, forcing this knight to d4, and after taking f4, this definitely looks quite dangerous for black to me. One idea that specifically comes to mind is the idea of g5 and knight f6, which is just something that, if it works, could very well lead to a mating attack. So this will be my improvement on move 9, knight c3 over the game Romanov-Svidler from Sochi 2012. Last but not least, I think the best move is probably to go f5 bishop to e7 over here, with the idea of sometimes f5 or f6 over here. And I thought that bishop h3 was an interesting way to tackle this, because bishop to g2, I believe f6 can be played, and now black is actually quite successful at just getting a normal position in which he got rid of the main strong point on e5. But after bishop h3, we do not allow f6, and we're pretty much forcing black to go f5. Knight h6 is also possible, but would once again be met with knight c3, knight e4, and even though our bishop is a little strange on h3, it also stops knight f5, so I still think this is promising for white. Instead, after f5, I think taking is possible, but maybe castles instead leads to interesting positions, and This is one of the lines where I feel that maybe this position, for example, could be quite playable for black as well. Of course, if white gets to play d4 in this type of position, we would be doing really well. But black might be able to play bishop to f6 and rook d8 in time. And this position, once again, is one of the lines where I think new games have to be played and new plans have to be found on both sides. But it's definitely not that easy for white here. The other idea is to go e takes f6 anyway, which I'm also not entirely crazy about, although I do think that it makes sense to immediately go for d4 now, also rendering white a sort of slight pull maybe. So after b6, d4, I think this type of position is also quite interesting. But once again, I don't think that black is really in major trouble here. But all the pieces are on the board. Black's king is a little bit more vulnerable than white's, and yeah, once again, it's one of the positions where I feel that as a black player you can sort of safely go for this, but it's still a rather interesting position and something to study as white. So this is more or less a direction I would go for in all the other lines. Of course, all of these variations will be accompanied with an ebook that I advise you to study. I hope you like the suggestion. B3, once again, it's slightly different from the previous lines because I feel it's a little bit more, a little bit less explored, and it allows a little bit more freedom on both sides. But there were a couple of ideas there, specifically getting the pawn to e5 is a central idea in all of these lines, regardless of really how you like to play it. And I think if you study this line well, you can really have good results and a lot of fun playing it. So I wish you good luck with it. I hope you like it. And next time we're going to be looking at the other Sicilians, such as the move 2g6 for black. Thank you for watching.